Hello everyone, today we talk about the institutionalization of the vassalatic-beneficiary relations in the Frankish world. As you know, we have discussed a lot Frankish history and society of early medieval times, of course, and observing the dramatic changes that these forms of political social interaction that would take, in fact, the name of vassalatic beneficiaries, or graphically speaking, it would later evolve into feudalism, essentially. Different at a different level, but still fundamentally based on the same relations that were enhanced and perfected and, in fact, institutionalized, was to change European and world history as a whole, right? And therefore, this is a particularly important process that represents really an institutional solution, right? It's not just the enhancement of a system that is evidently a clientelary form, right? Clientelary societies were all that existed at the time, but it's the particular type of introduction of these relations at the political level, the institutional level, and also the particular characteristics, of course, of Frankish society that had rendered it possible that make this sort of unicum in the history of Europe at this point. As you know, looking at a long-range perspective, you have essentially this Latin Germanic Europe that is slowly trying to develop in comparison to other powers like the Byzantine ones, or the Byzantine or Islamic ones that are based on this fundamentally Roman model of central, a Roman-Hellenistic model of political centralization. The idea of a of a centralized government with a control on a permanent military force and bureaucracy and effective and structured tax collection system that in the West existed in a much more restricted form. As you know, I'm not very dogmatic towards the possibility of talking about forms of centralizations literally as long as human societies exist in the first place, right? I don't go full modernist by saying, centralization exists only, with the modern state, and everything comes before wasn't like that. The Middle Ages was completely decentralized. A completely decentralized society would be fundamentally an anarchic society, and that has never represented any human form of in fact, social interaction throughout all history. And aside from this, however, it's important to stress the differences that objectively existed between these parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. And looking at the Latin Germanic world again, what you see is this Romano-Germanic kingdoms that developed after the dissolution of the western half of the Roman Empire, that objectively were following in part some patterns of those ancient centralistic models, right? If you look at how society was organized objectively, there was this idea that still the monarchy could call to arms all the landowners, that even laws were fundamentally applied all over the territory and over the various communities. Many Romano-Germanic codes of law, take especially the Burgundian or the Visigothic ones, were fundamentally Roman law readapted in other ways. But all of these Romano-Germanic kingdoms basically didn't make it to consolidate in more effective centralized forms. This is a statement that requires a bit more of clarification, because actually if you look what, for example, the developments were in Spain or in Francia, this is objectively true. Like, these were worlds where paradoxically the survival, the more intact survival of Roman social forms, or better, of the direct continuation of certain Roman clientelary forms throughout the early Middle Ages without any major disruption, had brought to an increase in privatization, for the same reason that the great estates of the Visigothic and the Frankish kingdoms were fundamentally too locally developed and powerful in order to be subdued by the central power, right, that had struggles. The Visigoths before the Arab conquest were fundamentally controlling as monarchs, just did like 30 kilometers outside of Toledo. The rest was in the hand of the aristocracy. Also, the councils of Toledo that were represented by this very powerful clergy was the same one, in fact, of the landowners that checked the monarchy. You know that basically by the end of the 7th century A.D., the Frankish kingdom doesn't physically exist anymore. You know, it's basically destroyed into this fragmentary world where you have all these various chunks of empire, of kingdom actually, that, well, I mean, also in here there would be to clarify something, because it's more complex than this, but looking at Gaul overall as the central power, you see it's fragmented enormously. Anglo-Saxon England and Longobards Italy were different from this. These were two powers that had, powers, it's a big word, but especially in the case of the Anglo-Saxon England, Anglo-Saxon England had never had that form. Anglo-Saxon England emerges in a system where Roman traditional political and social balances are disrupted fundamentally, probably even before the same Anglo-Saxon migrations from the same locals. And this is, think about the concept of heptarchy that was also much more shaded, because the thing was even more fragmented than that. In spite of all its messy outlook, was slowly, very, very slowly and very, very slow, evolving towards something more centralized, more compact, right? And this will be evident fundamentally by the 9th century. So it's really a long time perspective that really shows the difficulty of certain societies to with the means that they had at disposal to progressively extend more centralized forms of government. Longobards Italy said is an incredible example, not just of a functional elective monarchy, but also of actually a solid public authority. About Longobards Italy, if you think that it was fundamentally a set of anarchic duchies, you have to completely reread all the most recent historiography about that, because it's exactly the same opposite of that. The reasons for which it was thought like that before is, I don't know what, they were drunk while they were reading the sources, or I don't know what, but that was instead something somewhat more functional that was evolving towards models that are difficult to foresee, but that had developed objectively a direct control in large areas, in fact, of central and northern Italy, in a way that this monarchic power could grow in an expansive way. But it was still very different, because it has still some difficulties to provide, for example, more sound political and social classes that could at that point contribute mostly for the army, because as we will see later, we will take Italy as an example of what the Frankish vassalatic-beneficiary transformations entailed on a society that was not Frankish, right? Because that's like the best examples we have from the Carolingian times. But to make the long story short, Italy had a very different form of wealth distribution. Basically, the inhabitants of Longobards Italy were the richest in absolute terms per capita in the world, still at the time, from the times of the Roman Empire. But there weren't smaller, there weren't basically the same powerful vassalatic is obviously a Frankish term, as we will see now, but of Celtic origin, but there weren't these large estates that over which the monarchy could base in turn this enormously dynamic force that the Frankish world will be able to put together, right? And there are also other reasons. Maybe we don't have to discard this form of government from the options that were out there, because especially in the case of Anglo-Saxon England, you can see how somewhat virtuous system could still be standing, by the at the eve of the Norman conquest, Anglo-Saxon England had matured from that same Germanic base. The one of the most advanced administrations in Western Europe, basically. So it's important to see that there could be other alternatives. But the case of France, the case of Francia, let's say better, is literally what makes the enormous difference. We've talked a lot, actually, of this perspective, not much. I mean, we stress definitely the importance of vassalatic-beneficiary system as such, but we also observed how there were certain characters of that at that point involve simply the ethnic and political nature of the Carolingian Empire that made it so powerful objectively. But because the Franks had actually the opportunity to build an empire since Merovingian times. Objectively, the Franks rise as an empire. Always remember this. It was not a kingdom. Like, there was a kingdom that was the core of a much larger dominion that, in fact, as I was saying before, was based actually on other elements like the word Neustria, Austrasia fundamentally, but there was also Aquitaine and Burgundy, for example, that were together and bordering and making this kind of quadruple core of the empire that at that point didn't include just Francia proper, because that would be only Neustria and Austrasia. Aquitaine and Burgundy were not the Frankish kingdom, but were still part of this Merovingian domination. It's really Merovingian because the different chunks of the Merovingian family had split the territory in that way, and actually there is this corner between the four these four chunks that was a bit like the center of the empire, would remain in many ways also the one of later France under certain points of view. The true concept is that the Franks during the 6th century, late 5th, beginning 6th century, had the opportunity to expand with a power that at that point no other center in Western Europe had, right? As we have seen, Gaul had really not gone destroyed throughout the migration era, but throughout other conflicts. Gaul was overwhelmingly wealthy. This is something you have to stress radically in every at every level, especially in pre-industrial times when studying European history. France had the most massive and incredibly concentrated amount of agricultural resources that, when society and economics is basically founded on crop rate, that's what's gonna make real power, right? The real problem though with the Franks is that they, for cultural reasons, they had ended up to split their own domains among their sons at every generation, and so the Merovingians had lost this political unity that was otherwise would have granted them basically the opportunity of ruling over immense quantities of land. That is what effectively only the Carolingians will achieve finally to do, even for a relatively short amount of time, and losing it essentially for the same reason for which the Merovingians had loosened them. This problem that Frankish society was ruling on this terrifically enormous potential that, however, they couldn't keep together because of their political fragmentation, since a simple nobleman at that point could own a huge amount of land that could create like local military retinues and create problems for the same king to intervene in his lands. So as we know, that system held as long as the Carolingians were capable of basically making flowing under their own control all of these military forces in an expansive sense, like wars of conquest and so on, and not very enormously different from the Roman Empire after all, given all the obvious differences. when the empire overstretches and there is no more land with which to feed these clienteles, well, these clienteles simply take over, right? And the same Carolingians heavily contribute to that, because that's what they start to do at the same imperial level among the same imperial family. Within the same imperial family, brothers one against the other, and they split the empire. And so even the Carolingian Empire doesn't really fall, right? It's really simply ceases to be a politically, let's say, it's a big word, kind of a unitary element, right? A single element. In this sense, you have to think that individuals like Charlemagne and Louis the Pious were terribly lucky, because all their siblings, male siblings, had died. So that's even evident in the history of Charlemagne. If Carloman had not died, it would have been always this thorn in the flank, and at that point we would not have had a Carolingian Empire proper, as we know it, at least. So this is a bit just of background, but it's the concept that France has the means to control a much more highly stratified society, for which things are not really better in terms of average wealth or prosperity, but definitely can, if there is this mean of putting these powers, this potential together for an expansive reason, you can start building a central power on their own. France will overcome this problem, like periodically speaking, like as you know, in post-Carolingian times, basically the country, the post-Carolingian kingdom, what had the most radical problems with political fragmentation was exactly the kingdom of the Western Franks. That is paradoxical, because basically all the other post-Carolingian kingdoms were kind of better off at that point, would fail. Burgundy would fail, Germany will fail, Italy will fail. It's France that will rise eventually in the High Middle Ages as this gigantic power for medieval standards in Western Europe. But this thing is lost again. There's the 100 Years' War that maybe actually proves the strength of the Capetian basis that had been given from the 11th century onwards. But France will have these problems of keeping vassals together for a long time. Think also about the wars of religion. It's only with Louis the 14th, the Sun King, that France will achieve this final stage of a truly centralized state, and that problem will be relatively over. Relatively meaning that, of course, there is the French Revolution, which is a revolution from the lower strata of society at that point, but still based on this enormous demographic and agricultural power that France constituted in itself, and that, in fact, these other classes could weaponize at that point if they entered in control of it. So it's a long story over time that it's a sort of disease of abundance, right? It's this problem of controlling the resources locally speaking. It was the great problem of all the great powers of this time. In the absence of a centralized, of a fully centralized state, that is also very difficult to define, because what is a fully centralized state anyway? We live in most centralized states in history ever, but at this point, but it's not that they're completely centralized. Your breath is not controlled by other people. So there are so many ways that can be easily, changed, and sometimes even suddenly. But all this for saying that what happens in the Frankish world at that point was surely not unavoidable, but in the way it happened, had necessary to pass in a certain way through this vassalatic-beneficiary institutionalization, right? There was simply no power at the time that could achieve the power the Carolingians reached if they had not included basically all of this lesser potentates, let's say, represented by the local counts and bishops, into the construction of their own empire, right? And what is more extraordinary of this is how successful the vassalatic-beneficiary system was, even beyond the same Carolingian history. Like, the Carolingian Empire ends, but the Frankish vassalatic-beneficiary system expands everywhere, literally all over Europe, and you realize that, right? The Carolingian conquest already by itself absorbs many other powers, surrounding powers, that eventually that by osmosis goes up to, it gets into Spain, it gets into even the Western Slavs and in Scandinavia, and of course there are also other regions of Europe that are brought under French feudalism, and eventually with the Normans, like in England or in southern Italy, and that goes beyond, because even this broader Frankish model, we talked about it recently, talking about Byzantine history, is adopted in even partially by the Byzantines. Like, there is a push for westernization of the Frankish model. This is pretty damn effective, especially when your central institutions have failed at one point and you don't have enough resources to reverse the process. And even probably, and I don't know how much studied it is, but probably also the Islamic world underwent this passage. We can clearly see it even in Spain by certain standards, but also elsewhere. So it's this incredible. It's more than just the formula of swearing fealty and receiving the beneficial exchange. Is much more than that. It's a way of conceiving the world, of living politics and war and society, and it's a world that is capable of attracting aristocracies to create a shared, basically a shared the sense of belonging by certain standards, especially among the elites, and of rendering, paradoxically, Europe much more homogeneous from a political and social point of view than it had ever been, historically speaking. Right? Feudalism is this great homogenizer at the end of the day that brings to the Ancien Regime, as we have known it, is that dominates as a model up to the French Revolution and up to as its end, even at the end of World War I. So it's this great a formula that does work incredibly well. Before the nation state and mass societies, objectively, that's a tremendous way that through which you can paradoxically also centralize more, right? If there hadn't been this vassal clienteles, that there would have, it would have not even been possible to create the new feudal monarchies of the 11th and 12th century, and to start creating entities that were not to be born, like in fact the Kingdom of France proper, or others, right? So feudalism is an incredibly effective gluing factor that can allow to strengthen relations paradoxically through decentralization. And it sounds really like a paradox, and it is in many ways, and that's why this development has been so slow, but at the same time how it held and how it didn't produce other alternatives, right? It was a long process based on this progressive stratification of societies that in turn, however, favored as a spin-off of the growth also of other communities that were parallel, say, to the feudal elites themselves. Think about the cities in high medieval times that were born not just because there was some merchant that went venturing who knows where, like Pirenne wished things had happened, but medieval urbanization is a direct product of feudal socio-economical relations and the wealth that they had produced, right? So the myth of feudalism as a closed economy, as something, it's basically some, if you have a book that actually tells about that, you can't easily throw it in the bin, because that's not what we have seen it was, historiographically speaking. At this point, there is no no doubt about this. So, as you know, as you understand, we can easily expand these concepts, right? But sticking to Frankish society and to talk a bit more directly about this, we have, people ask, but okay, was there a moment in which this institutionalization actually happened, or where this process was accelerated in a sort of decisive way, right? Or however, that's really accelerated it brutally more than other periods. Well, yes, of course, and it is in fact the kingdom of Charles Martel, right, between 716 and 741. This question is, and this answers, have to take into consideration one thing. In my videos, I tried to stress a lot, for example, if you look at the one on the Frankish commendatio, how practically, it's not really that the Franks invented anything. Like, this was not really a Frankish invention. It was an adaptation that had occurred in Frankish society in the moment in which the Franks settled in Gallo-Roman Gaul, right? So a province that was very intensely Romanized, and that the Franks come to rule exclusively because they accept to basically become allies with these local elites, right? That's why Clovis converts directly to Catholicism straight away from paganism without passing through Arianism, and why the Clovis himself basically betrays Germanic egalitarianism for building a monarchy that in Germanic, sacrally speaking, culturally, was exactly the complete opposite model that it had existed in Germanic societies, and Franks were not that Romanized. I made several videos on Clovis that I consider one of the most important historical figures in the world history of the Western world. Where, in terms of outcomes, it was, consequences. I put him at the same level of Constantine objectively, because Constantine achieved definitely more, and more directly in his life, and in the periods directly afterwards. But what Clovis set between the end of the 5th and beginning of the 6th century is something that changed arguably the history of the world in comparable ways, if not even more. Right, and one of the reasons is that Constantinople fell in 453, while Western Europe, on that same feudal base that had this very ancient origins, was basically rocketing and becoming something more robust, and it had all began from there. But even before, in this sense, had begun from the particular condition, wealth distribution that existed in Gaul, in this Gallo-Roman clientele that now we will see. And therefore, it's important to get this long perspective. You can't say, oh, well, okay, so the vassalatic-beneficiary system has been invented by the Carolingians. Absolutely not. It was already there. And it was already there from centuries. What the Carolingians did was, in fact, to enhance it to the point of making it an institutional relation. And building an empire was based on those formal relations that entailed also further this, in part even social engineering of this particular concentration of wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer people that could be this referential power for the kings in the absence of a more centralized structure, right? That eventually backfires, but it remains as what eventually will save the same monarchies. If it's difficult, here to say, but you would think that the vassalatic decentralization would simply create a seigneurial anarchy. Well, that's what partly happened, always bearing in mind it wasn't completely anarchy, but if anything, for the same fact that this anarchy maintained, for example, public authority, like kingship, its prerogatives, and even the empire, right? So it's an extremely complex but somewhat sound and easily identifiable process that I've been talking a lot about. Really, if you go in medieval, in Frankish society playlists or medieval society playlists, you will find plenty of topics that talk about this, about vassalatic-beneficiary relations, about feudalism, about Frankish world, the commendatio, and all this stuff, right? So this is really a leitmotif in the history of medieval Europe. Basically, if you don't get this, you basically don't get half of the Middle Ages and therefore most of world history up to today, right? So this is particularly important, and it has to be understood as a defining feature of Western history in the way it developed, right? So why Charles Martel? So, well, Charles Martel emerges basically from this sequence of, he's the one who really sets the basis of secures, let's say, excuse me, the basis of Carolingian power, right? And he achieves that through a series of internal recompactation of Frankish power, of campaigns that are waged against other populations, some that were theoretically still part of the empire, like, I don't know, the Frisians in part, sometimes against bordering powers like Britain, sometimes even against foreign invaders like the Arabs. Of course, meaning that, the Frisians and the Bretons were still foreign to the Franks, of course. Britain will not be included into France up to basically the end of the 15th century, beginning of 16th. But let's say that Frankish overlordship had been recognized at that point since Merovingian times over this vast set of populations that surrounded the Franks, that the same people had basically brought to their knees through military force, right? And Charles Martel, in this process, in fact, collects all of these forces coming from fundamentally same Frankish society, all of these military clienteles that exist out there, of powerful landowners that were already military professionals at this point, at least by costumes and lifestyle, since a lot of time, right? Full professionalism really starts in the Frankish army with Carolingians proper. So it's correct to somewhat identify this transformations at that point, but still bearing in mind that this idea of the mounted warrior that owned a lot of land and that basically had all of this political and social prerogatives as a noble was already there in Gaul since late Roman times, and that had been reinforced eventually also by the Frankish warrior culture that the Germans had imported in large areas of Gaul. So it's particularly important because the passage from seasonalism and amatorial character warfare into a professional and fully and almost permanent, basically, military service is something that in certain classes is blurred, especially among the elites in Gaul through Merovingian and Carolingian times. The important here is that really explains the vassalatic-beneficiary relation is how these men were actually paid, right? It's not that in Carolingian times there were radical changes, for example, in productivity or in wealth. We talk about Carolingian Renaissance. If we really look at everything step by step, you realize it was, aside from re-education of the clergy and this spread, this new script and this effort for homogenizing the administrative capabilities of the empire, it was mostly an ecclesiastical process. There was no real renaissance of sort. It's not that the Frankish society became wealthier overall, or that however, even if they sacked and pillaged various neighbors, etc., that this changed structurally. the character of the empire became so powerful. I mean, the empire collapsed, as we've seen. So there are immense debates in here, and I will not talk about this, but the real problem here is how you feed the clienteles. How do you pay your military retinues? And that's the land. And you don't do it for free. The vassalatic-beneficiary relation, if you want, is this almost, nominal procedure that brings to a very few, real strengthening of the real relations, right? Although this was still a world that cared, of course, about oaths and how they were sworn, but definitely we know that in the political and military reality, what do you think this was actually, right? It was basically me giving you land through which you can basically build up your own military retinue, and just you giving me in exchange your nominal fealty, right? And at that point, the only thing that is gonna keep us together, like faithful one to another, is basically our common interests, our ability of waging war against each other, fundamentally, on the base of other military retinues, for which there is all this stratification, for which very soon these clienteles theoretically are institutionalized on the structural base. This is the comitatus, right? It's the comital district, but soon become something much more complicated at every level, because there are entire kingdoms now fighting among each other, that emerged from the splitting of the Carolingian inheritance, but there are also within the same comital district some private powers that maybe are even more powerful than the comital one, and that the comital maybe uses to strengthen its own power against the monarchy. It's very complex, and it brings to the mess that we know as the decline and collapse of the Carolingian Empire, that is one of the bloodiest chapters in absolute terms in early medieval history, and that leaves no doubts on the fact that these system, if the vassalic-beneficiary relations were literally, in fact, the only form of political and social, say better, of institutional relation existing between monarchic power and this and the rest of the community, well, it's pretty evident that they didn't make any difference, or if anything, they were the ones that caused the same disruption of the empire. And that's the same reason why, for example, the church acquired so much power under Carolingians, because that was possibly the only institutional tie that held. The Carolingians realized that the church was not a private entity, so even if the clergy was part of the same exact milieu from which the comital class came from, at least the church was not hereditary. So basically, if a bishop even took matters in his own hands, when he died, he still had to elect a new one. It was not a son who succeeded him, right? So that was easier to control. The church was a kind of its own autonomous, independent institution, the same one that had legitimized Carolingian imperial authority in the first place, that depended from Rome theoretically. So it was a most natural ally, and in fact, also historically speaking, feudal kingdoms would always be like, usually at least towards the monarchy, right? France, Germany, they all developed with this obvious alliance of the monarchy and the church against the local the lay vassals. We say that with this push for centralization from one side and from autonomization from the other. So these are the dynamics that take place. So looking at this from a strictly Frankish perspective is how had it originated. So how this clientelary system of Gaul did bring eventually Frankish society to adapt to it, right? It's largely the history of Clovis, and and of the passage of Frankish society, how we intended, that Franks became from a Germanic confederation to essentially a Romano-Germanic kingdom, especially based in power in areas that were largely Romanized, right? So, same reason why in France people speak a Romance language, right? And there were differences, of course, within the same Frankish world. Like Austrasia, in the east, remained much more similar to, I don't know, to the Germanic origins, right? And there were incredibly striking similarities between the Franks and the Saxons, for example. The Franks of Austrasia. Neustria was different. Neustria was really Romanized, and even if northern Gaul was less Romanized than the center and the south, it still was very different bases, and it was basically the copy of it was overlapping the Roman Belgic province, right? Excuse me. And so the Frankish army, and here it's important to make of it a military history, because, as you know, all of this system will be at the base of the development of Western knighthood, right? It's not all about this, but let's say that the Frankish kingdom is the larger contributor in this process in Western Europe, and it has to be understood in this sense. The Frankish army, just like the one of the greatest part of barbarian populations, was based on these groups of free armed men. They were tied among them by complex relations that stretched from basically this extended family, familiar kinship, to relations of fealty and of personal dependency, right? They were warriors of free condition that voluntarily fought for a chieftain. That's how Clovis led the Franks into Gaul, and how he expanded the same personal power through, like conquering other peoples, is strengthening his individual prestige. Germanic society worked in that way, in a world where, like in Germany, where basically literally the easiest way to make money, to make a dramatic change in your life is to conquer someone else. The effectiveness of the leader was the only element for which a certain degree of centralization was accepted in a strictly military function. However, in a society that otherwise despised deeply these forms of monarchy, right? And this, it's important to realize that even Germanic societies at all times in history, and literally everywhere in the Germanic world, were oligarchic. Like, the idea that there were freemen living without differences of sort, it's a myth. It never happened, but it definitely was a massively less stratified society than what, say, the Roman world had been, and especially the Germans of the far north were basically the closest you could find to those ideal forms of egalitarianism. But during wars, and as you know, during the migration era, that there were many, the need for a chieftain naturally required a certain form of centralization. If you don't have a certain form of centralization, you're done for in war, right? And that's the same reason why we have a martial law in case of national emergencies, because at one point, if you really want to control a society united, you can do more good to it by essentially taking away, suspending certain rights, than pretending that democracy alone can work. Obviously, it's a quite dark consideration, but still, it's how the same societies had rationalized it without having, quite of a much more sophisticated way of looking at the thing, but still having a strongly democratic character, if we can say. So this is important because it makes you understand the necessity at one point to have a certain amount of wealth concentrated in someone's hands. Even the Greeks that had this democratic ideal recognized the necessity of waging war and entrusting certain power to someone with the due limits. The same Romans did when, even at the height of their, let's say, republicanism. But it's important that here the thing changes when the Franks migrate into Gaul. So Gaul, as we have seen, was the region where the Franks settled at the beginnings of the actually not at the times of Clovis, because the Gauls settled the Franks settled there at the beginning of the 5th century, but they still settled close to the Rhine in regions that were once very strongly Romanized. Like the Romans, in fact, had settled the same Franks as Federati around the city of Cologne, that had been the famous Colonia Agrippina, one of the most important cities along the Rhine. Now, by the beginning of the 5th century, that was heavily depopulated. It underwent a very sharp de-Romanization, especially through the migration of the Germanic population. So that's an area that will remain, in fact, kind of distant, very different from what the internal side, let's say, of Gaul was. Instead, it was heavily Romanized. And this area was, let's say, the Franks got acquainted now more directly with the political culture of the Roman world. And especially when Clovis brought the Franks to settle, definitely in Neustria, so reaching as far as the Atlantic Ocean from the, let's say, the western Gallic coast, things changed deeply, because the recruitment of the army, for example, like the one of the ruling class, were based on the relation of the single individuals with a kind of a abstract reality that today we would call the res publica. That was the official name of the Roman Empire, telling you the truth. Many people believed that the official name of the Roman Empire was something like Romanum Imperium, for example, but the actual name of the empire has always been res publica, simply because the empire was not a form of government. The empire was just a military faculty given by the divinity, right? It wasn't the actual political form. And res publica in Latin means literally this public, let's say, thing, as more generic and specific, concerning the fact that, it's stressing especially the exception of the common, publicus here meant literally as of the people, right? Good, because that's the etymology. So what you have here is a very different world than what the Franks have come into. That, however, already in itself had developed in parallel to this abstract concept of authority, very strong, very important, very great, very strong personal or clientelary relations. And this didn't constitute an ideal model, but it was literally they made up literally the political and social organization. So there is some debate, because obviously even the Franks throughout the 5th century had been somewhat probably already in part Romanized, of course, but not excessively much, telling the truth. But especially they had probably started developing something a bit less, a bit more oligarchic, let's say, at this point. So even for Clovis, at the end of the day, it was enough for him to behead some of the greatest chiefs of the Frankish Confederation. Let's remember, it was very loose, politically speaking, to effectively achieve power, to become the sole ruler of the Franks, in a way that, in terms of Germanic tradition, was unheard before, right? What Clovis did in there is something that doesn't happen in any other Germanic context ever. Clovis is an absolute exception, and one of the most dramatically successful one that ever existed. In fact, in the West, as we were saying before, we were even comparing the consequences of Clovis' actions to the one of Constantine. Objectively, they had on the long run similar outcomes, in quantitatively speaking. So what can we say at this point? That, of course, at this point was the meeting of these two different models of social organization. That is, the Germanic and the Roman one that you find basically everywhere in Western Europe at that point, right? Because all Western Europe comes to be dominated by some Germanic population that has, however, necessarily to rule with the support of the local population, simply, if anything, for demographic relations. These were sometimes just, few tens of thousands of warriors in regions that could reach even the million of population size. So doesn't hold, as you understand. So there was a mixing of the elites. That is essentially what even the Carolingian word frankly emerges from. And the Carolingians are, as you know, called the Pepinids are Nulfingians, right? Because they stemmed from this from Pippin of Heristal and of the daughter of Arnold of Metz, was this Gallo-Roman or Frankish at that point maybe bishop. Cultural models that at that point had completely blended. So at this point it doesn't make sense to say, were these Romans, were these Germans, aside from the fact it was the Celtic component as well that had always somewhat remained in terms of a ethnical substratum. And so this union brought to, in the case of the Franks, this meeting with the Gallo-Roman model of personal relations. It was founded on public relations, right? Meaning what exactly is that the Romans had also partly institutionalized these relations, but let's say in a less privatistic fashion, like now the Franks would do. Let's remember that Roman Gaul had at this point been abandoned. There were other populations fundamentally controlling them. The Romans had been controlling them from the distance, and there were important changes. Like the very south of Gaul was very Roman in culture, but still, the same Italy or Spain had substantially changed at this point. They had met Germanization as well. So we're talking about a period of change. We're not going to enter in detail because we made so many videos about the migration era at this point that you can simply take a look in that playlist if you want to learn more from me. But to make a point, because here it's difficult, it's a conceptual history, right? Let's say in this way that Gallo-Roman society was still based on this clientelary relations dominated by Roman tradition. Bishops were particularly important. The appointment of bishops especially had acquired this great public political function, right? The great cities of Gaul had been hegemonized by the local bishops that had even been able to, for example, in case of Tolosa, southeastern Gaul had to even stop the Hunnic siege, at least to resist to it, had really taken political and military power in their own hands, right? That's how far Christianity had been able to penetrate at all levels of the elites in places like Gaul. And in fact, much of the episcopate at this point is fundamentally of senatorial origin. Like, these are not the first Christians that kind of worked underground from the lower strata of society. Like, no, bishops were the most radically educated and powerful, and they were really the the best elements of society, right? And because they were powerful, they had land, they owned power directly, right? Remember always at this time, bishops could still had families, right? So they were building. There had been this passage from the Gallo-Roman senator to the Frankish bishop, or somewhat in the middle. It's so confused. It's even difficult to distinguish them in phases or in characters, right? And from one side, there is also the necessity now for the Franks settled in Gaul to codify and to render more explicit and checkable the personal relations that existed within the same Germanic population of the Franks, right? What Clovis has created a kingdom, right? For a literal kingdom now, the king has to now control these populations that up to a few time before had been used essentially to do whatever they liked, as working as individual clans essentially that settled wherever they wanted. Always remember that the Franks in this were one of the least stratified populations compared to the other Germans. Their same name means the free, right? These were confederacy names. It's not that there was a people called like the Franks. Every clan had its own traditions. The Franks had emerged from northwestern Germany. Part of these tribes were also the ones that had crushed the Roman legions at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. They still retained this idea that they were a confederation that in case of needs would fight together, but for the rest they had to live free. Clovis reversed this and starts controlling literally the whole people after having wiped out their aristocracies, and now it has many tools to control this population. A population that now settles into a Roman territory that already has its own kind of centralized administration, that albeit decayed is still something radically different from what the Germans had been ever used to. The elites, the episcopal and senatorial elites, as we've seen, are allied with the monarchic power that Clovis has built, and they legitimize it. They honor it because they realize that now basically he is letting them rule in there, within the system that strengthens the kind of the centralistic capabilities in there. And especially there is a territorial control now to deal with, so that now the population that you control is traceable, territorially speaking. You can make them pay taxes, you can locate them, and sedentarization is somewhat permanent now, right? The Germans, the Franks weren't much of the globetrotters of the migration era. There were our populations that went back and forth across Europe and the Mediterranean, but they had migrated as well, as we've seen now, so that they abandoned completely their kind of mildly semi-nomadic character, and they settled for good now. So these are great changes. There is the problem of regulating the new relations that this society now is based on. So in what really consisted this change? Well, it was the formal definition of vassalatic-beneficiary relations at an institutional level. So how did this work? Well, it was fundamentally a contract between two people, two freemen actually. It was a free contract, which one of the two sides committed itself to fealty and the others to maintenance, right? So through the oath of fealty, the vassal, which is a Latin, it's in Latin it's vassus, but it's actually coming from a Celtic word that means serf. And this is important because we're talking about Gaul, remember. So this means that even before the Roman conquest, basically the Gallic Celtic world had developed clienteles of this kind, with this an idea that no, there weren't tribesmen and everybody was free. It was already the idea that someone was a serf, basically. That there was an elite. Celtic Gaul was extremely rich. It was most advanced Celtic land in terms of wealth, social stratification, proto-urbanization, etc. So these relations had already been felt very strongly, right? Differently from other tribes, also had lived relatively close, and instead were still somewhat, very balanced, with a strong middle class and a very few serfs and a very few aristocrats, right? So through this oath of fealty, the vasses, so kind of the weaker side, entered into the clientele of the most powerful side, which was known as the senior, by the way. So this term that in Latin means that it would evolve into the French seigneur, right? So signories, etc., that identify, in fact, the development of the vassalatic-beneficiary system. Senior is means like an elder, right? So he was more powerful, who's more eminent, more. So the senior, in turn, committed itself to maintain the vassus, either directly in his own house, let's say, in his own property, or indirectly by, in his own house, or indirectly by entrusting him with certain sources of income, like lands or other goods of different nature. So this is important because it's not that the senior sells something to the vasses, right? This is the legal point of the story, is that theoretically this object that is entrusted or whatever, because sometimes we think it has to be an object, but it can be just a form of revenue of some sort, of any sort, right? It's not even just a physical thing. It can be just even protection, for example. But eventually it evolves with, given that the nets of relations are very wide and they extend on actual, they're based on land power, of course, and landed power and material properties, that becomes more of a concession of a good that, however, remains in the property of the senior, of course, so that you're entrusted this good like a sort of prepaid payment in order for you to render another service of fealty to the senior. So the object of such concessions was called with the Latin name beneficium, right, which comes from, literally, etymologically speaking, it means to do good, right? To which, over time, was superimposed or even substituted another term of Germanic origin, that is feudum. That comes from Germanic feud, that has nothing to do, in fact, with the beneficium. Etymologically speaking, that was used to indicate cattle. It's an ancient Germanic term when the Germans didn't have much of a developed agriculture, but especially during migration era, they started developing cattle, and that was the greatest amount of wealth around there. So hence feudum and feudalism, right? That's the etymology. So this is in part, as you know, already this is nothing new. This is how clientelary societies had already developed, in part. It's the sum of Celtic, Roman, and Germanic traditions of clientelism that mix together, right? So this type of relations characterized Frankish society at every level. This is probably the most important thing to remember in here. We're not talking about, of course, every society, as we've seen, was clientelary, but this formalization of the vassalatic-beneficiary relations was now existing from the imperial level to the peasantry, right? So it was a type of relation through which the monarch was surrounded himself with functionaries and of military um, chiefs, and it was the same relation through which these people in turn managed to recruit fighters and to create their own clientelary retinue and circle, right? So the concession of the beneficia, beneficia is plural of beneficium, was necessary in order to tie to yourself numerous clients, and it presupposed in this sense the availability of large patrimonial resources. From the other side, in order to have let's say having in general available such wide clienteles, it also allowed to obtain ever greater resources, right? And this is where Charles Martel changed a lot part of this story, because Charles Martel rises from within the same Frankish world. Yes, it does expand its partly the borders against other populations, and it achieves definitely something in terms of conquest and increase of Frankish rule over other peoples. But his major changes begin from within the same Frankish society. The problem is, where do you find at that point the beneficia to reward your own clients? You have to take it from some other Frank or Frankish subject at least. And what Charles Martel does in an extremely clever way, and this is probably one of the most important dynamics that occurs during 8th century Europe, is that it starts taking these properties from the ecclesiastical goods, right? How this happens? Well, Charles Martel suffered of a bad press, if we can say like this, in his times. And guess why? Because the only people who wrote at the time were the clergy. So the clergy has kind of an ambivalent attitude towards him. From one side, he eventually becomes king of the Franks, and of course there is a somewhat of a continuation of the ecclesiastical allegiance to him. But there are other ecclesiastical patrimonies that get objectively alienated by Charles. And many people say, oh, well, he touched the ecclesiastical property. Well, what was exactly this ecclesiastical property? You may imagine, the poor little Frankish priest in gold that works his tiny backyard with some vegetables and so on. This terrible, evil Carolingian knights arrive and take away from him bread from his mouth and all. Well, no, it didn't happen like that. This clergy was actually some of the most powerful political military seniors of these clientelary systems. And the land that actually, so these were bishops largely, that had their own military retinues, their own power, their own seigneuries, and they were essentially the product of this Gallo-Roman society flourishing with the political fragmentation of the Merovingian kingdom in the previous centuries. That is, especially those lands like Aquitaine, especially in southern Gaul, that were more distant from the Frankish center of power, had started to expand, their own power at the expenses of the royal domain. Like when Clovis had come to power and founded the Frankish kingdom, territorially speaking, theoretically, everything belonged to, not even to the Frankish people, but to him personally. That's how the Franks grow with their mindset. This is very important because, first of all, the Germans, initially speaking, had never had to deal with this problem in the sense that resources were so limited that it was more about what they could raid, what they could own, right? And in this sense, even what became a spoil of war was felt like by right a property of he who had fought in order to conquer it, to acquire it. So that's what Clovis basically does when he conquers the kingdom. He seizes it and he deems it as a private domain, which means that actually that public ideal of Roman origin that we have said before had completely disappeared. Not just from the it's not just not being present among the Franks, but at that point not even among the Gallo-Roman elites, who deemed themselves to be the lords now of those lands when the Roman public authority had vanished from there. So this is how the Franks see the thing. This is something you never have to forget when you study Frankish history. It's about the cultural incapability of conceiving a degree of public authority. In this sense, sovereigns like Charlemagne and Louis the Pious were enlightened sovereigns, meaning that they, aside from being great rulers in their regard, as we all know, but they were the ones who went beyond this, Frankish cultural background, saying, we can't continue like this. We can't, for example, split our properties at every generation, even among imperial family, like having to split the empire in several parts just because every single son wants his own part as a private possession, right? They tried, obviously they fail, as we've seen, because this mentality is so deeply rooted into the Frankish world that it can't be even reduced by a certain standard. That's where even this sense of feudal sense of class and of belonging stems from. Is it from this complete lack of regard towards a public authority? Like the concept is, who are you to ask me what I have to do? Like in high medieval Europe, even the nobility, even towards the monarchy, reasoned in this fashion. So you can imagine how difficult it was in this context to create any form of centralization. And the reason was that, as we've said before, these people had an enormous amount of power in their own hands privately already. These were all the ancient Roman latifundia that had remained into now in the Frankish Gallo-Roman nobility's hands, without the possibility of a central power to really control them directly. Like even Clovis had initially attempted to build a kind of a degree of centralization where there was some sort of administration, but was very loose. He could control his own people, but his own people would split in turn when at his death his sons would split their father's inheritance in several parts. So that's how messy really Frankish society is. And that's why the vassalatic-beneficiary system is so important, because it basically was an answer to a world that was irremediably privatized in character, and for which, if you really wanted to rule in some way, you had to invent some other forms of relation that at this point could stand even against just this formal idea. I mean, this is really literally a person entrusting a property to someone else by saying, swear to me that you will give it to me back. Is it something that you would do anyway? No. But the reason why you wouldn't do this anyway is that aside from now we have states who, defend our rights and enforce the law and properly law and a certain thing. But the point is that in this world, these ties are required. It's not about the fact of giving the land to someone, because in order to control your land at these times, you forcibly have to need someone who works for you. The real problem here is part of a larger milieu that is ruled by a person who can effectively control more or less of his property, and the more this potentate, the more powerful this potentate is, and the more you can hope to share its benefits in this sense, as long, however, as you remain faithful to it. So it's not a wishful thinking of saying, now you will have to be faithful to this person for no reason, just because you swore an oath. It's because you probably, if you entered in that relation, either you were obliged by conditions of force, like that person was already enough powerful to enforce it on you and therefore you couldn't escape, or you needed it desperately. In fact, Carolingian society is a moment of also of great social mobility after all. The real crystallization arrives. I mean, there's never, it's never achieved actually, but it's something that belongs much to later times rather. Where this nobility has already made the race, run the race through the various Carolingian conquests to get, to prove to be more courageous on the field, and therefore to be rewarded by the emperor, the king, in a way that they could get land and enter into the milieu. This was also a way, in fact, for the same imperial power to bring in fresh clienteles that in this sense had nothing to lose, because maybe they were poor people who were fighting just for the power that the emperor would give, and through which the emperor could counter instead the old aristocrats who already had the land and wanted to just compete with monarchic power. So what happens with Charles Martel is that he finds this huge amount of land that the ecclesiastics had gained, right? And much of this land actually was originally public land. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that it was theoretically the private land of the king himself, right? That theoretically had seen in Merovingian times all the kingdom as a huge private possession that this elites could definitely use, but on behalf of the king, and that instead, when in fact monarchical authority had collapsed in late Merovingian times, these guys had simply expanded in without any right and taking it. So what Charles Martel really does is recovering much of that formerly, say, public land that the ecclesiastics, these very powerful aristocrats, had seized with arms, just like a lay count would do. And obviously there were many lay counts who had done the same thing, but the ecclesiastic elites here were they were very powerful, right? Always remember, here you have bishops and abbots that had to field lots of men for the Carolingian army. They had theoretically to build it even up to on the field, and some of them field of battle, some of them even fall into battle. So here that tells you even how blurred the difference laymen and clergymen is at this point. And Frankish society is basically all like this, right? It's not about, I mean, to us it seems messy because we think that these categorizations are somewhat meaningful by themselves, but at the time it was actually a pretty kind of flat, homogeneous reality where, it was normal that there was a powerful aristocrat, doesn't matter whether lay or clergy, that owned this huge amount of land, of cattle, and had peasants working for him and had military retinues, and that's what literally all Frankish power in history had been about, right, up to now. So what Charles Martel starts doing here is taking and finding, let's say, the resources for building much larger clienteles that had ever existed now. Because this was still Frankish land. Always remember that the Carolingian power was structured from within the same Frankish base of power. But what Charles Martel does is subtracting land to someone and giving it to someone else, which already has land, right? Already, because it's a basis of the Carolingians. And therefore, what happens in here is that society gets intensely more stratified and stratified, because this vassi get much more land than they had before. And this means in turn that they have to provide more military retinues for the Carolingians in their army, right? More and more. Which means more wars of expansions, which means more land in the hands largely of these same vassals, which become even more powerful. So you can understand how social stratification is catalyzed in here. And this is what originates at the end of the day through continuous warfare, medieval knighthood, and the medieval heavy cavalry that we all know about, because it really starts from here. Obviously, all Europeans knew how to go on horseback, and this culture of the mounted warrior that was also a chieftain and freeman was I mean, a freeman, and then naturally a chieftain had to be a warrior in that sense, a mounted warrior pro excellence was already there. But what the Carolingians make now is that they start building certain military clienteles that basically fight continuously. Like, if you look at Carolingian history here, it's basically a century of literally uninterrupted military campaigns. Like, it was like even 2 or 3 military campaigns in 1 year sometimes, definitely once a year. And the only thing, at one point the Frankish chroniclers stopped even saying, that there had been a military campaign that year, because it was so normal that unless that military campaign was something particularly more important or more different from the others, they didn't even have to need to write it down, because who read those chronicles already knew that. In fact, the only thing that they list is the very few years, like 2 or 3 years overall in 1 century, in which there hadn't been a war, a campaign, a military campaign. Now, do you realize what it means to have a century of continued warfare and of lengthening of this process without non-stop? It means that you pass from a relatively seasonal warfare where the warrior stays only his own land and fights every once in a while against the neighbors, but fundamentally remains there, to a professional military force that fights basically all across Europe for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, and that is based on heavy cavalry right now. So these are people would not only have the wealth, thanks to their beneficia, to be equipped like no other knight in Europe had ever been before on this large scale, structural scale, but they also fight professionally, that is all their lives, together, which means in turn an enormous amount of collective training that is basically what no other European cavalry in the Latin Germanic world has. It means that you create a true war machine, and you can argue that the Franks are a disaster for many other things. We've seen public authority 0, education practically 0. This the only thing, there is one thing that the Franks know how to do better than anybody else, and that's the only thing that they do, as a matter of fact, with their elites. But this is to fight. This is to fight, and this is how the Carolingians manage to conquer the empire that we know of, because these guys spent their entire life literally on horseback to fight someone. Doesn't matter whether it's the Arabs, it's the Slavs, it's the Longobards, it's the Vikings, the internal rebels and so on. They do it, and they are basically an unstoppable military force, right? Obviously there were setbacks sometimes. Take the Battle of Zuntel, Battle of Roncesvalles. Nobody is above defeatability, let's say, but basically they're the greatest power now the West has seen from centuries, and they come to conquer even lands that not even the Romans had ever come to conquer. For example, Saxony, right? The Franks are at this point a massive war machine. They're nothing like the Merovingians had been, because they have professionalism from their side, collective training. These guys know how to fight in formation, cavalry. They can start coordinating their cavalry charges in a way they never have seen before. So this implements the need for better equipment. Even the stirrup starts being introduced at this time, not because, nobody had ever thought about a stirrup, that was known from quite a time now, but that now what you need, because you finally have the mass that is necessary to literally throw yourself against the enemy infantry formations or against our cavalry without much of an afterthought. And you do on a regular basis, that stabilizes your stay on horseback, let's say, during the charges, the impacts. So it's not a technological thing. The technological thing, of course, comes later. It's more a necessity that requires a technology that you invent for the case, not to discover magically a technology and you invent heavy cavalry. It absolutely didn't work like that, as any historian of economics or technology knows. But it's a very progressive thing. Not even by Norman times, stirrup had become a universal for knights. Normans who had learned how to go, maybe not to go on horseback from the Franks, because they had actually learned it from the Bretons, but surely they were at that point Frankish knights, 100%, albeit a couple of hundreds of years later of development of vassalatic-beneficiary relations. Now this is really what makes the difference. This is what crushes the Arabs at Poitiers. This is what makes the Franks conquering the Lombard kingdom. This is what the Franks make destroying the Saxons like a hammer, time after time. They banned these people that absolutely didn't want to be conquered. Was bitter enemy of the Franks since centuries. There is a great transformation during the 8th century. Of course, it's a moment in which we can't see true sources, etc. But all the hints tell us that this thing had changed greatly, and of course, it wasn't. It was a radical change, but not in a temporal sense. It was a radical change because now the roots of a system had been set. Now these roots were to grow and to flourish eventually, and it took a lot of centuries as well. The full supremacy of cavalry and feudalism as a model is the 13th century, right? And it just lasts for 1 century, because after, in the 14th, you already have infantries defeating heavy cavalry. But after a couple of centuries of subordination. But what you see here is much more than just a military model. It's really politics and society that changes. It's the creation of an elite now that has never seen so much wealth concentrated in one hand, especially in continental Europe. It's impressive. It's remarkable, right? And this is what brings to the difference in a clientelary world that will remain a clientelary world, because as we've seen, it everywhere was like that, but not with this particular ratios of strength, right? That never happened like that. So obviously Charles Martel policy against this, let's say, ecclesiastical property is not a trend. Of course, the same clergy enters to be part of the system at one point, but it's how at the beginning Charles Martel does it, and how it changes Frankish society from the within in this different wealth distribution. And the way the ecclesiastics, maybe it's interesting, had managed to acquire land, which is something you find in many other regions where the Franks, for example, can't do much about, because at that point there were political reasons not for doing so. For example, in Italy, where they arrive and they see that the church obviously owns a freaking lot of land, but they don't touch it because those were the guys who were crowning them emperors at that point, not just the local Frankish clergy, right? But the widespread European ecclesiastical practice to get land was basically occupying it, as we have seen in the way it was, and then to settle it with people who would work it. Because obviously, if you have a lot of land, and nobody works it, you have nothing, right? So you have to settle other people, but making them understand that you are in charge there and knowing how to control them. So this was much easier in other regions of Europe, because in other regions of Europe there weren't so many powerful military private retinues like in Gaul. For example, in Italy it wasn't like that. The average Frankish nobleman had even more land than the same Longobarд king as a personal property, right? So wealth in these other lands was much more more evenly distributed. This is true for Longobard Italy, for Saxon Germany, for Anglo-Saxon England. So the surroundings of Gaul, and therefore there wasn't much of a competition, and this had favored the survival of more sound public authorities. As we were saying before, the Longobard kingdom functioned quite well because there weren't internal competitors to monarchic power. The monarchy worked well because there was a shared, benefit from a functional monarchy, from this middle and small property owners that were fine with having a king living in a capital with various agents who were local judges and controlled what the local dukes did, and who fundamentally developed their power in the city and not in the countryside like the Franks with that land, but just in the city. So basically the only internal clientelary competition that existed in Longobard Kingdom was within the offices that were attached to city administration within the same, in fact, royal administration, right? So it was all functional for society. So the church did something similar, meaning that by settling small owners that didn't have much of a power, fundamentally poor people in their land, that they made this very long-term contracts known as emphitheuses. Now the emphitheuses entailed that excuse me, I gave you and your descendants at that point this land in concession for something like 99 years, right? So at that point people didn't live that much, so it was like several generations, after which theoretically that land could come back to the church, and especially around Rome, like everything belonged to the church, like every single piece of land, which meant that some people, the Pope couldn't literally control at that point. Everybody was settled in one place. It was impossible. So this was interesting because obviously people for living settled somewhere, and the Pope could still claim, saying, that belongs to the Roman Church. So this was extremely convenient at that point, and that's how the Church had incorporated in many lands of Europe so much property, and how it would be somewhat shielded by the same feudal culture in many ways. That the Church gains, especially after that had always enjoyed, actually since Roman times, a lot of immunities, especially in fiscal matters, and in the Carolingian Empire would reinforce them essentially because they were allied with the church, who had to crown their monarchs as emperors, and that would help them to maintain this little degree of centralization, as we have seen, by making these ecclesiastical domains essentially tied to monarchic authority against this ferocious lay aristocracy that wanted to expand its power against any centralization, including seizing ecclesiastical property, right? So it was really a mess. Yes, it was. It was really a mess. And naturally, a system like this brought to in a way or another to create a very narrow, a very limited, let's say, aristocracy that was extremely powerful, both towards the king and their own clients, marginating as a consequence also those men, also free condition that did not dispose of enough property to have a clientele on their own. So the free men were progressively marginated now from the participation to the army and the public life. Do you understand how important this is? And that's what I mean when I talk about social stratification. It means that at this point, to make it very simple, the Germanic freeman becomes a vassalatic peasant, right? So it obviously takes forever. It didn't happen from one day to another, but substantially, that's how it would go. That's what the trend was. The 10th century was the most important century for this process, but it had already started from ever. Like, it started from there, like from the same Roman times. It's not just about the Germanic society. It's just like literally, the ancient Roman colonist who was a freeman who had land, and during the late Roman Empire with civil wars and barbarian invasions and epidemics, etc., they flee wherever they were because they are impoverished and they have to seek refuge under somebody. So they're theoretically two freemen, respectively, but one is desperate for protection and goes living as a colonist in someone else's land to leave with a certain contract, with contemplates a certain canon, a certain amount of, in order for you and your family to stay on that land, you have to produce a certain number of products. That's how it had started, right? And these are the basis of the vassalatic-beneficiary system. So whether you want to see it from the ancient Celtic clienteles, the Roman, let's say the Gallo-Roman ones, or the Frankish Germanic ones, it's basically the same thing in different ways, and it's basically about the land distribution of Gaul in Gaul, that, as we've said, is very, very different from other peoples, right? Gaul, always remember that Gaul, at the end of the Western Roman Empire, was in quantitative terms the wealthiest land in Western Europe. It had an enormous amount of resources, but at the same time, it was the most highly stratified land ever, which means that only a very few people enjoyed all of that wealth and therefore could afford those military retinues that we're talking about. This system is further enhanced eventually by the Carolingians in the way we know, right? And that's what really makes the difference. That's really what makes the Middle Ages the way it's gone, and so many other things. It all starts from Gaul, right? Then, excuse me, you can also see it somewhere else, right? Similar problems were present also in other regions, but never as much as in other places. Always remember that oligarchies have always been like that. There has always been someone wealthier who detained the effective power. Even when you look at these Germanic societies that are regarded as this primitive example of egalitarianism, and you think, those were people were free. Absolutely not. They weren't free. My eyes, they were free. My eyes. There was always an oligarch. You read the assembly of free people. Those were the oligarchs. There was people who had clienteles on their own, and it would be also in those societies increasingly like that. Even those who were not conquered by the Franks. We have talked a lot recently about the Scandinavian societies and how they progressively, those hadn't been conquered by anyone, but they shaped themselves in that way. And it's interesting that this is kind of a general trend, in fact. You can find it even in the Byzantine Empire, with different dynamics, but substantially in the same way, same direction. You can find it even in the Islamic world at one point. So Um, it's even difficult to explain why, because this would require a globalizing, uh, you know, explanation. I have it, but maybe we don't talk about it now. The problem is essentially economical, or better, well, maybe it's not really. Let's not exaggerate. It's a sum of political, social, economical problem, whatever. But it has to do with the degree of let's say, of distribution of power, which means also how much you are capable of producing by yourself, right? Because if you think that this is a general trend, it's obviously wrong. Look at the French Revolution. At one point, something changed, right? Even after this ancien regime had crystallized from medieval times, and that happens because there are new society, the new classes that become wealthier and that push for more rights and so on, right? Because they have the material means to impose that. It's always a struggle. It's kind of a materialist explanation, but it's not entirely like that, of course. But it that this matter who owned the land, especially in a world of pre-industrial, character, is a pretty important way of at least reading society at this time. Um, so, so this um, economical organization of the great property, typical Frankish world, would be known as in different ways. There is the seigneurial system, or the manorial system, or the courtis system, and it fundamentally consolidated over time, right? There were naturally, as we've seen, the elites who were pushing for it, but if they succeeded, it's because at that point they had the favorable moment for doing it. Aristocracies had tried to centralize further, for example, in the Germanic world, but they had failed, right? Because at one point the middle classes of freemen were too strong for an aristocracy to impose its power more than. So even in here, always reflect that the settlement in the former lands of the Roman Empire is particularly important. We have seen it in the case of Clovis, why it happens. It's basically just a relatively few Franks in front of a world that is already functioning in a much more much more stratified way, and the Franks simply get absorbed through it, and therefore the system is enhanced. As we've seen in other lands, it's not like that. So the way this transforms is naturally this great these great farms, let's say, the curtas, who eventually will manage to absorb also small property and subduing several, many former small landowners, freemen, who would all become basically dependent from the great landowner, that often also would start to exercise powers of public nature. This is also important to remember. The Carolingian Empire, as you know, worked with this form of land distribution, for which the count that was the head of a district was, entrusted by the king, this district, with all the attached public, let's say, property, right, to which the public functions were attached. So it was justice, the right to exact tolls, to police. So initially this was a way, in fact, to control and to rule the empire, as we've seen. It somewhat worked for a certain time, as long as this balance was kept in place by wars of expansion and so on. Then eventually the thing collapses, and these powers autonomize themselves, and the monarchy loses contact and control of them. So what I would like to reflect, though, is how this mechanism had an impact, and a particularly hard impact, on certain European areas the economy of which was instead based essentially on small property, right? As we were saying at the beginning of the video, the Lombard kingdom is it's one of the greatest examples. It's dramatically better documented than other lands in Europe. It was, for the Carolingians, it was the most important kingdom to which the same imperial title was attached, because there was the Rome, and therefore whoever controlled Italy controlled the empire, the imperial title, etc. Obviously, the center of power of the Carolingians was this land between today's France and Germany and Benelux, and those areas. But very soon, even the original repartition of the empire was in fact including that part of Central Europe and then Italy altogether, like a long corridor from the North Sea to Rome, basically. The Lotharingia, but that would be. Then eventually that failed, especially the part in north of the Alps didn't quite survive as a real kingdom, while the Italic one actually did. But this is also for saying how superficial in some way the possibilities of the Franks to build up a monarchy into shifting its with a center of power in non-Roman Europe had been, right? Eventually the center of power would remain more, let's say, evidently enucleated entities, like what would be roughly the modern France, Germany, and Italy, right? You don't find anything in the middle that lasts for very long. So mostly it's also geographical, but it wasn't really. It's not that the Carolingians planned it necessarily. It's just that it came to be like that. It was easier to manage in that way. But talking about the Lombard kingdom, you can see in there that the local culture was completely different. The majority of the social fabric was composed by freemen, and on the political organization that contemplated a widespread participation to the exercise of arms and to the royal assemblies, which meant that the people had an important weight in this. And there wasn't any destabilizing power who could fundamentally try to carve out its own place into the system and to start oppressing someone else. Like in France, it was the norm, basically. At the same time, it is true that the Lombard kingdom, however, was changing slightly. Towards the last years, like the last decades in the 8th century, fundamentally, you can see even from the Lombard king's laws that society was, that the kings were trying to stem the initiatives of certain magnates, fundamentally, were more powerful than others, who were basically occupying someone else's land. But this is a much smaller phenomenon, actually, and there is no comparison with what was the norm in Gaul, right? So when the Carolingians arrived, there are certain areas that are massively, brutalized by this system. Especially certain areas of the northeast were completely different in this regard. And the Carolingians even had troubles, in fact, to control them, because the local nobility didn't want to give up what their system had been. So there was a very long and progressive integration of certain parts of the kingdom, for which sometimes Charlemagne was busy in Saxony, had to run through during winter with all the armies. I think it was definitely abnormal to avoid that Italy would rise, and they freaked out more than once. At that point, there's the Battle of the Livenza River, for example, which it seems that basically the Carolingians, as far as we know, might have even been defeated. Nobody really knows, actually, but there is one point in which, in fact, you see that the progressive substitution of Carolingian nobility to the Lombard one is gradual, right? In Lombardy and in Tuscany, it's easier because those were, in fact, more centralized territories, where um, the effectively the royal control was easier. So if you switched at the top, it was easier to control, which is a good testament actually to Longobards administration. That when in fact the Carolingians take a massive amount of administrative practices and political and political culture from Italy, not just obviously from the Lombard kingdom, but from Rome, from the Romanized, the formerly Byzantine territories that had this much more centralized system that the Carolingians tried. Well, there's limited strengths in that regard, as we've seen, to apply also in the Frankish world, where meeting a remarkable opposition, right? And while other lands in the peninsula had to be dealt with more care, because it was, Frankish arrival changed a lot of things. It was tough, and there was a resistance because of that. It's interesting that how it happened in Saxony too. In Saxony, made the Carolingians sweat for like 3 decades, but at the end of the day, they, probably were so exhausted that, they gave up completely. In fact, Saxony becomes an enormous success of the Carolingian models that, of course, they do not find the same ground for being applied, because simply was not enough wealth to find to form that kind of stratification. But that also is a land that is included in the empire, and for which eventually the same empire will rise again in later times, in Ottonian times. So expressing in that sense a same Frankish legacy from terms of public imperial models and so on. But that's another story. But even in these lands, in fact, the introduction of the socio-economical system of the Franks entailed the increase of the large property and social uniformation of the workers of the land in this common tradition of dependent peasants, right? So even in countries like, as we were saying before, all Europe at the end of the day becomes feudal, right? These lands even starts having their own seigneurial dynasties of comital origin, like in the Frankish world. The same goes for Italy, the same goes for Germany, for all these lands where the Carolingians had ruled. And that's what makes, in fact, post-Carolingian kingdoms also very similar among each other. I mean, with all the due differences, but I think the greatest Carolingian legacy in absolute terms was this ability of kind of uniforming certain bases and forms of culture and connection, right? You cannot argue that all this system started from this central states of basically modern day France, Germany, and basically northern and central Italy. Those were Frankish systems that expanded this, that emanated further vassalatic-beneficiary models beyond their own borders. So it's a great deal in the history of Western civilization. It has incredible consequences that we discussed often on Schwerpunkt, and that we will hopefully keep doing it in the future as well. But this is truly, I mean, I rarely stress this so much, but this is truly a big deal, right? This is not a matter of saying those things like, Charlemagne, father of Europe, all this thing. Europe didn't quite, wasn't quite conceived like in the way we do up to the 13th century. Even from there on, it was quite of a long way before it comes to define what it was today. At this point, I mean, not even modern nationalities de facto existed. They were something very different. That, however, the post-Carolingian times especially contribute to define. I would say that, um, however, this is really a massive turning point in history, and the reason why it's maybe not taught in these terms is that um, we concentrate on the history of the Carolingian dynasty as such. We say, what, you know, many people concerned about why do empires rise and why do they fall. You know, it's terrible questions. Nobody knows, and there is this terrible, who knows what's the truth and how. Well, if you know what these dynamics are about, you have the answer, right? So it's not a big deal, and it's just that it doesn't sound so epic or heroic, like kings defeating other kings in battle, and all this thing. Where were this? How were this kingdoms? Was this empire split into? Why? Let me remember the dates and the thing. But if you really don't get to this core dynamics, internal dynamics, you basically can't interpret them at all. You can learn about dates and names and battles, but at the end of the day, you will not understand anything about why this happened in the first place, right? Because you don't understand which forces moved these things. And what I also care about this is, however, the longer perspective of this, like, as I was saying before, it's not much about the Carolingians themselves. The Carolingians, in this sense, made the real difference, but on so many levels. But let's say that not all what they used was their own creation. I mean, it came from centuries and centuries of cultures and administrative practices and local traditions that contributed to form eventually what the Carolingians could use. Had the Carolingians existed in Italy, that they could have not achieved that, for example, or in Anglo-Saxon England, they could have not achieved that. They could do it in Francia and its empire, because that was I was saying designed, but it was fit for that, right? And we owe, in fact, much of this transformation to these dramatically important figures like Charles Martel and so on. But also in here, I was reading, maybe we'll go a bit deeper in this stuff soon, but that it's not much about the individual figure. Like, we don't clearly know, for example, when these practices were accelerated during Carolingian times. Like, Charles Martel is like a bit the traditional figure in which we say he was the guy, but I was reading something some time ago, maybe I will make a video about that, that says, Charles Martel was important for all what you want, it helped this process, but we don't really know whether, this was more, this process was more accelerated during his reign or the one of Pippin the Short, or the one of Charlemagne. We don't clearly know. We just know that the tendency is that one in that century. And the 8th century is very important in this sense, and we owe this to Carolingians. However, I think for now we can conclude here, and also for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.